A thin whine filled the air. It whirled and howled through the trees, upsetting the squirrels. A few birds flew off in disgust. The noise danced and skittered round the clearing. It hooped. It rasped. It generally offended. The captain, however, regarded the lone bagpiper with an indulgent eye. Little could disturb his equanimity. Indeed, once he had got over the loss of his gorgeous bath during the unpleasantness in the swamp all those months ago, he had begun to find his new life remarkably congenial. A hollow had been scooped out of a large rock which stood in the middle of a clearing, and in this he would bask daily whilst attendants sloshed water over him. Not particularly warm water, it must be said, as they hadn't yet worked out a way of heating it. Never mind, that would come. And in the meantime, search parties were scouring the countryside far and wide for a hot spring, preferably one in a nice leafy glade, and if it was near a soap mine, perfection. To those who said that they had a feeling soap wasn't found in mines, the captain had ventured to suggest that perhaps that was because no one had looked hard enough, and this possibility had been reluctantly acknowledged. No, life was very pleasant. And the greatest thing about it was that when the hot spring was found, complete with leafy glade ensuite, and when in the fullness of time the cry came reverberating across the hills that the soap mine had been located and was producing 500 cakes a day, it would be more pleasant still. It was very important to have things to look forward to. Well, well, screech, well, howl, honk, squeak went the bagpipes, increasing the captain's already considerable pleasure at the thought that any moment now they might stop. That was something he looked forward to as well. What else was pleasant, he asked himself. Well, so many things. The red and gold of the trees now that autumn was approaching, the peaceful chatter of scissors a few feet from his bath, where a couple of hairdressers were exercising their skills on a dozing art director and his assistant. The sunlight gleaming off the 6 shiny telephones lined up along the edge of his rock-hewn bath. The only thing nicer than a phone that didn't ring all the time, or indeed at all, was 6 phones that didn't ring all the time, or indeed at all. Nicest of all was the happy murmur of all the hundreds of people slowly assembling in the clearing around him to watch the afternoon committee meeting. The captain punched his rubber duck playfully on the beak. The afternoon committee meetings were his favorite. Other eyes watched the assembling crowds. High in a tree on the edge of the clearing squatted Ford Prefect, lately returned from foreign climes. After his 6-month journey, he was lean and healthy. His eyes gleamed. He wore a reindeer skin coat. His beard was as thick and his face as bronzed as a country rock singer's. He and Arthur Dent had been watching the Goldafrinchens for almost a week now, and Ford had decided to stir things up a bit. The clearing was now full. Hundreds of men and women lounged around, chatting, eating fruit, playing cards, and generally having a fairly relaxed time of it. Their tracksuits were now all dirty and even torn, but they all had immaculately styled hair. Ford was puzzled to see that many of them had stuffed their tracksuits full of leaves, and wondered if this was meant to be some form of insulation against the coming weather. Ford's eyes narrowed. They couldn't be interested in botany of a sudden, could they? In the middle of these speculations, the captain's voice rose above the hubbub.
All right. I'd like to call this meeting to some sort of order, if that's at all possible. Is that all right with everybody? In a minute, when you're all ready.
The talking gradually died away and the clearing fell silent, except for the bagpiper, who seemed to be in some wild and uninhabitable musical world of his own. A few of those in his immediate vicinity threw some leaves to him. If there is any reason for this, then, it escaped Ford Prefect for the moment. A small group of people had clustered round the captain, and one of them was clearly beginning to speak. He did this by standing up, clearing his throat, and then gazing off into the distance, as if to signify to the crowd that he would be with them in a minute. The crowd, of course, were riveted, and all turned their eyes on him. A moment of silence followed, which Ford judged to be the right dramatic moment to make his entry. The man turned to speak. Ford dropped down out of the tree. "Hi there." The crowd swiveled round.
"Ah, my dear fellow. Got any matches on you?
No.
Or a lighter? Anything like that?"
No, I haven't. No matches. Instead, I bring you news.
"Pity. We've all run out, you see. Haven't had a hot bath in weeks."
Ford refused to be headed off. "I bring you news of a discovery that might interest you."
"Is it on the agenda?"
Ford smiled a broad country rock singer smile. "Now, come on."
"Well, I'm sorry, but speaking as a management consultant of many years standing, I must insist on the importance of observing the committee structure."
Ford looked round the crowd. "He's mad, you know. This is a prehistoric planet."
"Address the chair."
"There isn't a chair. There's only a rock." The management consultant decided that testiness was what the situation now called for.
"Well, call it a chair.
Why not call it a rock?"
You obviously have no conception of modern business methods."
"And you have no conception of where you are." A girl with a strident voice leapt to her feet and used it. "Shut up, you two. I want a table of motion." "You mean boulder emotion."
"Order! Order!"
"All right. Let's see how you're doing." He plonked himself down on the ground to see how long he could keep his temper. The captain made a sort of conciliatory harumphing noise.
"I would like to call to order the 573rd meeting of the Colonization Committee of Fintel Whittlewicks."
10 seconds, thought Ford as he leapt to his feet again. "This is futile. 573 committee meetings and you haven't even discovered fire yet? If you would care to examine the agenda sheet, or agenda rock." "Thank you. I've made that point. You will see that we are having a report from the Hairdressers Fire Development Subcommittee today." "Oh, will next Tuesday do?" "All right. What have you done? What are you going to do? What are your thoughts on fire development?" "Well, I don't know. All they gave me was a couple of sticks." "So what have you done with them?" Nervously, the hairdresser fished in his tracksuit top and handed over the fruits of his labor to Ford. Ford held them up for all to see. "Curling tongs." The crowd applauded. Never mind. Rome wasn't burnt in a day. The crowd hadn't the faintest idea what he was talking about, but they loved it nonetheless. They applauded. "Well, you're obviously being totally naive, of course. When you've been in marketing as long as I have, you'll know that before any new product can be developed, it has to be properly researched. We've got to find out what people want from fire, how they relate to it, what sort of image it has for them." The crowd were tense. They were expecting something wonderful from Ford. "Stick it up your nose," which is precisely the sort of thing we need to know. Do people want fire that can be applied nasally? Do you? Yes. Yeah. Nah. Whoa. Yeah. Nah. I don't know. Yeah. They didn't know. They just thought it was great.
"And the wheel. What about this wheel thingy? Sounds like a terribly interesting project."
"Ah, we're having a little difficulty there." "Difficulty? Difficulty? What do you mean, difficulty? It's the single simplest machine in the entire universe." The marketing girl soured him with a look. "All right, Mr. Wise Guy, you're so clever. You tell us what color it should have." The crowd went wild. One up to the home team, they thought. Ford shrugged his shoulders and sat down again. "Almighty Zarkon. Have none of you done anything?" As if in answer to his question, there was a sudden clamor of noise from the entrance to the clearing. The crowd couldn't believe the amount of entertainment they were getting this afternoon. In marched a squad of about a dozen men dressed in the remnants of their Golga French and 3rd Regiment dress uniforms. About half of them still carried kilozap guns, the rest now carried spears which they struck together as they marched. They looked bronzed, healthy, and utterly exhausted and bedraggled. They clattered to a halt and banged to attention. One of them fell over and never moved again. "Captain, sir. Permission to report, sir."
"Yes. All right, number 2, welcome back and all that. Find any hot springs?"
"No, sir."
I thought you wouldn't.
Number 2 strode through the crowd and presented arms before the bath. We have discovered another continent.
When was this?
It lies across the sea, to the east. Number 2 faced to turn the crowd. He raised his gun above his head. This is gonna be great, thought the crowd. We have declared war on it. Wild abandoned cheering broke out in all corners of the clearing. This was beyond all expectation. Wait a minute. He leapt to his feet and demanded silence. After a while, he got it, or at least the best silence he could hope for under the circumstances. The circumstances were that the bagpiper was spontaneously composing a national anthem. Do we have to have the piper?
Oh, yes. We've given him a grant.
Ford considered opening this idea up for debate, but quickly decided that way madness lay. Instead, he slung a well-judged rock at the piper and turned to face number 2. War? Yes. On the next continent? Yes. Total warfare. The war to end all wars. But there's no one even living there yet. Interesting, thought the crowd. Nice point. Number 2's gaze hovered undisturbed. In this respect, his eyes were like a couple of mosquitoes that hovered purposefully 3 inches from your nose and refused to be deflected by arm thrashes, fly swats, or rolled newspapers. I know that, but there will be one day. So we have left an open-ended ultimatum. What? And blown up a few military installations. The captain leaned forward out of his bath.
Military installations, number 2?
For a moment, the eyes wavered. Yes, sir. Well, potentially military installations. All right. Trees. The moment of uncertainty passed. His eyes flickered like whips over his audience. And we interrogated a gazelle. He flipped his kilozab gun smartly under his arm and marched off through the pandemonium that had now erupted throughout the ecstatic crowd. A few steps was all he managed before he was caught up and carried shoulder high for a lap of honor around the clearing. Ford sat and idly tapped a couple of stones together. So what else have you done? We started a culture. Oh, yes? Yes. One of our film producers is already making a fascinating documentary about the indigenous cavemen of the area. They're not cavemen. They look like cavemen. Do they live in caves? Well, they live in huts. Perhaps they're having their caves redecorated, called out a wag from the crowd. Ford rounded on him angrily. Very funny, but have you noticed that they're dying out? On their journey back, Ford and Arthur had come across 2 derelict villages and the bodies of many natives in the woods, where they had crept away to die. Those that still lived were stricken and listless, as if they were suffering some disease of the spirit rather than the body. They moved sluggishly and with an infinite sadness. Their future had been taken away from them. Dying out! Do you know what that means? We shouldn't sell them life insurance? Ford ignored him and appealed to the whole crowd. Can you try and understand that it's just since we've arrived that they've started dying out? In fact, that comes over terribly well in this film and just gives it the poignant twist which is the hallmark of a really great documentary. The producer's very committed. He should be. I gather that he needs to make one about you next, Captain.
Oh, really? That's awfully nice.
He's got a very strong angle on it, you know. The burden of responsibility, the loneliness of command. The captain hummed and hashed about this for a moment.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't overstress that angle, you know. One's never alone with a rubber duck.
He held the duck aloft, and it got an appreciative round from the crowd. All the while, the management consultant had been sitting in stony silence, his fingertips pressed to his temples to indicate that he was waiting and would wait all day if it was necessary. At this point, he decided he would not wait all day after all. He would merely pretend that the last half hour hadn't happened. He rose to his feet.
If we could for a moment move to the subject of fiscal policy.
Fiscal policy? Fiscal policy? The management consultant gave him a look that only a lungfish could have copied.
Fiscal policy. That is what I said.
How can you have money if none of you actually produces anything? It doesn't grow on trees, you know.
If you would allow me to continue.
Ford nodded dejectedly.
Thank you. Since we have decided a few weeks ago to adopt the leaf as legal tender, we have, of course, all become immensely rich.
Ford stared in disbelief at the crowd who were murmuring appreciatively at this and greedily fingering the wads of leaves with which their tracksuits were stuffed.
But we have also run into a small inflation problem on account of the high level of leaf availability, which means that, I gather, the current going rate has something like 3 deciduous forests buying 1 ship's peanut.
Murmurs of alarm came across the crowd. The management consultant waved them down.
So, in order to obviate this problem, we effectively revaluate the leaf. We are about to embark on a massive defoliation campaign and burn down all the forests. I think you'll all agree that's a sensible move under the circumstances.
The crowd seemed a little uncertain about this for a second or two until someone pointed out how much this would increase the value of the leaves in their pockets, whereupon they let out whoops of delight and gave the management consultant a standing ovation. The accountants among them looked forward to a profitable autumn. "You're all mad. Absolutely barmy. You're a bunch of raving nutters." The tide of opinion started to turn against him. What had started out as excellent entertainment had now, in the crowd's view, deteriorated into mere abuse, and since the abuse was in the main directed at them, they wearied of it. Sensing this shift in the wind, the marketing girl turned on him. "We've been on a journey. We went to try and find out something about this planet." "Nah? Well, have I got news for you, my love. We have discovered this planet's future." Ford waited for this statement to have its effect. It didn't have any. They didn't know what he was talking about. He continued. "It doesn't matter a pair of fetid dingo's kidneys what you all choose to do from now on. Burn down the forests, anything. It won't make a scrap of difference. Your future history has already happened. 2 million years you've got, and that's it. At the end of that time, your race will be dead, gone, and good riddance to you. Remember that. 2 million years." The crowd muttered to itself in annoyance. People as rich as they had suddenly become shouldn't be obliged to listen to this sort of gibberish. Perhaps they could tip the fellow a leaf or two and he would go away. They didn't need to bother. Ford was already stalking out of the clearing, pausing only to shake his head at number 2, who was already firing his kilo-zap gun into some neighboring trees. He turned back once. 2 million years!
Well, still time for a few more baths. Could someone pass me the sponge? I just dropped it over the side.
A mile or so away through the wood, Arthur Dent was too busily engrossed with what he was doing to hear Ford Prefect approach. What he was doing was rather curious, and this is what it was. On a wide, flat piece of rock, he had scratched out the shape of a large square, subdivided into 169 smaller squares, 13 to a side. Furthermore, he had collected together a pile of smallish, flattish stones and scratched the shape of a letter onto each. Sitting morosely round the rock were a couple of the surviving local native men whom Arthur Dent was trying to introduce the curious concept embodied in these stones. So far, they had not done well. They had attempted to eat some, bury others, and throw the rest of them away. Arthur had finally encouraged one of them to lay a couple of stones on the board he had scratched out, which was not even as far as he'd managed to get the day before. Along with the rapid deterioration in the morale of these creatures, there seemed to be a corresponding deterioration in their actual intelligence. In an attempt to egg them on, Arthur set out a number of letters on the board himself, and then tried to encourage the natives to add some more themselves. It was not going well. Ford watched quietly from beside a nearby tree.
"No,"
said Arthur to one of the natives who had just shuffled some of the letters round in a fit of abysmal dejection.
"No. Q scores 10, you see, and it's on a triple word score. So, look, I've explained the rules to you. No, look, please, put down that jawbone. All right, we'll start again, and try to concentrate this time.
Ford leaned his elbow against the tree and his hand against his head. What are you doing, Arthur? Arthur looked up with a start. He suddenly had a feeling that all this might look slightly foolish. All he knew was that it had worked like a dream on him when he was a child. But things were different then, or rather would be.
I'm trying to teach the cavemen to play Scrabble.
They're not
They look like cavemen.
Ford let it pass. I see.
It's uphill work. The only word they know is grunt, and they can't spell it.
He sighed and sat back. What's that supposed to achieve?
We've got to encourage them to evolve, to develop.
He hoped that the weary sigh and then the anger might do something to counteract the overriding feeling of foolishness from which he was currently suffering. It didn't. He jumped to his feet.
Can you imagine what a world would be like descended from those cretins we arrived with?
Imagine? We don't have to imagine. We've seen it.
But
Arthur waved his arms about hopelessly. We've seen it. There's no escape. Arthur kicked at a stone.
did you tell them what we've discovered? Norway, Slaughterboss signature in the glacier. Did you tell them?
What's the point? What would it mean to them?
Mean. You know perfectly well what it means. It means that this planet is the Earth. It's my home. It's where I was born.
Was?
All right, will be.
Yes, in 2 million years' time. Why don't you tell them that? Go and say to them, "Excuse me, I'd just like to point out that in 2 million years' time, I will be born just a few miles from here." See what they have to say. They'll chase you up a tree and set fire to it. Arthur absorbed this unhappily. Face it, those Zeebs over there are your ancestors, not these poor creatures here. He went over to where the ape-men creatures were rummaging listlessly with the stone letters. He shook his head. Put the Scrabble away, Arthur. It won't save the human race, because this lot aren't going to be the human race. The human race is currently sitting around a rock on the other side of this hill, making documentaries about themselves. Arthur winced.
There must be something we can do.
A terrible sense of desolation thrilled through his body that he should be here, on Earth. The Earth which had lost its future in a horrifyingly arbitrary catastrophe, and which now seemed set to lose its past as well. Nah, there's nothing we can do. This doesn't change the history of the Earth. You see, this is the history of the Earth. Like it or leave it. The Golgafrinchians are the people you are descended from. In 2 million years, they get destroyed by the Vogons. History is never altered, you see. It just fits together like a jigsaw. Funny old thing, life, ain't it? He picked up the letter Q and hurled it into a distant privet bush, where it hit upon a young rabbit. The rabbit hurtled off in terror and didn't stop until it was set upon and eaten by a fox, which choked on one of its bones and died on the bank of a stream, which subsequently washed it away. During the following weeks, Ford Prefect swallowed his pride and struck up a relationship with a girl who had been a personnel officer on Golgafrincham, and he was terribly upset when she suddenly passed away as a result of drinking water from a pool that had been polluted by the body of a dead fox. The only moral it is possible to draw from this story is that one should never throw the letter Q into a privet bush. But unfortunately, there are times when it is unavoidable. Like most of the really crucial things in life, this chain of events was completely invisible to Ford Prefect and Arthur Dent. They were looking sadly at one of the natives morosely pushing the other letters around.
Poor bloody caveman.
They're not...
What?
Never mind. The wretched creature let out a pathetic howling noise and banged on the rock.
It's all been a bitter waste of time for them, hasn't it?
I hope you'll join us at the restaurant at the end of the universe when the next chapter drops very soon.